This is Dave Letele. He is a legend, especially around South Auckland. He's a boxer, the brown butterbean they called him, and he's been running food banks, I think, since COVID. There was a story earlier this year where he basically came out and spoke against, maybe the wrong word, but was pretty pissed with John Key. I think he felt like maybe John Key sort of used him a bit before the election and, gave him his phone number. John Key? Sorry, Christopher Luxon. What am I talking about? I get those two mixed up all the time. And then he kind of ignored him and left him. And I'm not saying it's the final straw in this hat, but it's now ended up that the work that Dave has done needs to all stop. He's run out of money. He's run out of headspace to do it. It's a really sad day. Let's have a look at the story.
The man behind Brown Butterbean Motivation is closing down his South Auckland food bank. Dave Letele's charity has been a crucial lifeline for struggling families, but he says government funding isn't enough and it's taking too big an emotional toll on him to fundraise the shortfall. Yvonne Tahana reports.
Dave Letele's never been afraid of a fight, but the battle to feed our most needy
I just feel
is
for him.
now too big.
It's been so I try not to think about it just because it's emotional. It affects my family. It affects my mental health. And then now I've got to think about the families that we're letting down.
Announcing today he's shutting down his South Auckland food bank.
This is terrible news for many of the struggling families in Auckland, particularly South Auckland, but also sad for Dave Letele. This guy has a big heart.
His food bank started the day before lockdown after learning of a mum of four with no money or food. This year his organisation received $87,000 in government funding and Letele fundraises the rest. He needs $1 million a year.
We done an impact lab report that showed a $13 return for every $1 invested in us. And I show this to every government bureaucrat that comes to see us. But still we can't get any support.
So this is the tie-in we were going to do to the Gumboot Friday. Now, I've seen quite a few reports today that haven't spoken that highly of the investment into Gumboot Friday, talking about the return on investment. Whereas when you've got these guys, for every dollar they put in, they get $13 of value. When you hear a government kind of going, KPIs and the best money for your bang for your buck, and we're going to treat every dollar like it was your own. We're not going to be an ATM. This seems to be a place that fulfills all those criteria. So if there's not the ability to do it, it's heartbreaking, Emily, when you see him.
And it's only $1 million. $1 million, that's it. And you just saw billions in debt. 175 billion versus 1 million. That's insane.
And let's say it again. I know we say this a lot, but we're going to keep saying this until the next election. $2.9 billion to landlords. So you could have $2.8999 billion to landlords and $1 million to, I might have got that 9 wrong, by the way, probably did. You know what I'm saying? $1 million less than 2.9 billion and continuing to help feed. And the thing is, with this austerity government, these guys and girls, this government is making life worse for these people. And not only is it making life worse for these people, the people trying to help these people are struggling to do it. We're hearing about these places shutting down all the time. Dave Letele is quite high profile, so he gets his story told like this, but we're hearing about other places. So these guys, this coalition of cruelty is screwing over the most vulnerable, and it appears that they are stopping people looking after the most vulnerable to look after the most vulnerable. So it's just, it's harsh always round. Let's get through to the end of this.
Prime Minister says the government's given $175,000 to the charity.
First and foremost is the government is working really hard to get our economic house in order, so that actually that's how we help people through a cost of living crisis.
In Otara, the ASA Foundation runs a food bank service. Its trustees say the closure couldn't have come at a worse time.
Getting close to Christmas and also the end of school year. Many of the families that depend on his service and help are going to really feel it.
It receives no taxpayer funding. Dave Letele says the funding model's broken.
It's just so hard.
And from Christmas, one less charity at the table. Yvonne Tahana, One News.
Heartbreaking, like just heartbreaking. People doing the right thing, helping the most vulnerable, still not able to help the most vulnerable. I want to put up a tweet. And we had Dr. Gary Payinda on last night talking about some issues to do with the government getting rid of chief medical officers, frontline workers, and they're going to get rid of them. And I just saw this from Gary's Twitter today. Now, this is to do with Gumboot Friday and to do with some of the controversies, not necessarily around their funding, but about how they operate. Because since that story came out yesterday about them getting that big amount of funding and it being inconsistent and unusual is the quote, and the appearance of it looking like a bit of a, stuff you Labour from the National Party making a promise pre-election with no oversight whatsoever, and then they had to do it, right? So there's lots of things going on there. This is what Gary wrote today. And I'm reading this specifically because we've just heard about a charity that for every dollar investment, they get $13 worth of value. So that's the reason for reading this. It's worth a minute reading to stuff and other public sources, legitimate concerns among them. This is about Gumboot Friday. Oh, sorry, we should read this one here because this is from this is what he's responding to. Mike King's charity is providing these services for a fraction of what the government does. The government spends millions to copy the tracking system I Am Hope uses for monitoring appointments regionally. Then it goes on. And this is his response to it. It's worth a minute reading stuff and other public sources, legitimate concerns among them. How they use unqualified counsellors, provide few sessions, don't count the professionals' costs, education, training, while government does, making Gumboot Friday look vastly more cost-effective than it is. How they had to change the title of their lead clinician because they weren't appropriately qualified. How they handled a donation, conflict of interest, and officially assumed a political role. And how they have very high administration and travel expenses with only half of every dollar going towards actual counselling. I'm going to keep reading that, but just to be blunt, that would imply that the $24 million of taxpayers' money given to them, $12 million got spent on counselling. And now think again about what Dave Letele said. For every dollar that they get $13 worth of value. That means if you had given, I'm now going to try and do maths in my head, 24 million to them, 240 plus 24, about 300. It's about 300 million worth of value. Just looking at the KPIs, Mr. Luxon, looking at best bang for your buck, looking at all these business ideas. Gary goes on, it's not reassuring reading. Then you add in the government's shady process prior to giving them 24 million of taxpayer money, which has just been independently assessed and found to be questionable and lack proper oversight. A real funded, trained and professional public mental health service is what's needed. And that's what's been underfunded or in one case defunded, then refunded when word got out. No one is against ad hoc services popping up, but not if it takes away taxpayer money from actual essential public mental health services. So there you go. Your thoughts, Emily?
I would love to know what 24 million into the public service would do. Because it's not like we couldn't put that in. I mean, charities are great. They fill in a lot of holes. But if you're going to give 24 million to them and then not also boost the public sector in this case, why not just give the 24 million to the professionals in the health sector and give it to them instead and see what they can do with it?
I think the answer, in my opinion, to that is this was Luxon going, fuck you, Labour. Like, that's what it was.
Because he was the one that gave them the 24 million. It was his government that gave them 24 million.
Yeah, so prior to the election, they'd missed some marks on funding, like Gumboot Friday from the Ministry of Health, not from Labour, but you know what everyone says. And that's because they didn't tick all the boxes. So basically their application, their administration, that kind of stuff wasn't on. So of course, Mike King, who I have respect for from his position as a comedian and stuff, he's been around for a while. He got in front of the cameras and he made a big fuss about it, and he talked about how, this government wasn't funding them and yada, yada, yada. So Luxon pops up and says, we'll fund you. It was, all it was a fuck you, Labour. And it's a bit like when they said that they were going to fund the 5 cancer drugs. And they'd done no process or looking into that. And then when they got into government, they had to go and fund, I think it's 49 drugs, because the 49th drug on the list was one of the 5 they'd promised. So they make this, I'm not saying cancer drugs are a bullshit promise, but this bullshit promise when I'm saying they haven't done due process before the election, and then they have to fulfill it after the election, and they look like absolute goose eggs doing it. Like, it's great that we've got these 49 new drugs. Don't get me wrong.
Oh, it's
but the
great.
only
I think
reason
it's
we got
benefited me too. It's great.
100%, it's great, right? But the reason that they had to do that was because they made this silly promise pre-election with no research. In my opinion, it's the same for Gumboot Friday. Because then after the election, when they gave them the $24 million, there was no oversight, there was no due process, because that took such a big pool of money out of that sector. Other ones missed out. And then after they did that, they went, oh, maybe we should check to see if everything's in place. And it wasn't. Now, let me make this clear. I'm not making any accusations towards Gumboot Friday. I don't know of their inner workings. But I know I used to support groups like Tier Fund and World Vision a lot. And I know that between 85 and 92 cents per dollar that they got went to the, to the child or to the village or whatever. So 50 cents in the dollar is a really low fee for a charity to get through to the end product. That means $12 million goes on basically administration wages, travel, offices. That's a big chunk out of that, a big chunk. No accusations being made, but it's from knowing people who work for Tier Fund and stuff, that's a small percentage of your dollar given, or our dollar, government's dollar given, that gets to the end user.